Gatineau Center for Law and Economics. Can you hear us correctly?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Thank you so much. So you can introduce yourself and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Kristian Stout. I bring a dual perspective to these proceedings as both the Director of Innovation Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics and as a musician who earns royalties from every major streaming platform. This combination allows me to approach your questions from both an economic policy standpoint and from the experience of an artist navigating today's digital music landscape. I have 5 brief points I'll make, and then I'm happy to take questions. Let me start with a fundamental point about audio streaming economics that's often misunderstood. Audio streaming operates through complex, multi-layered revenue sharing systems that defy simple taxation. Platforms don't pay fixed per stream rates to artists. Instead, royalty payments flow through intricate systems involving platform revenue, rights holder agreements, and artist contracts with labels or distributors. The result is that artists typically earn fractions of cents per stream, something between 0.3 of a cent and 0.8 of a cent USD. It's a little higher on different services, a little lower on others. And that's after multiple intermediaries have to take their cuts from that revenue source. Imposing something like a blanket levy on this already complex value chain risks serious unintended consequences. Audio platforms operate in commoditized markets where subscription prices have remained relatively stable for over a decade while facing extreme consumer price sensitivity. Research shows that about 1/3 of listeners won't pay anything for streaming at all, and 2/3 cap their willingness to pay at just $10 per month. Video streaming faces similar challenges, but with different dynamics. Where traditional broadcasters enjoyed protected spectrum, today's streamers face unprecedented competition. Over 200 available platforms about offering 500,000 unique video titles to Canadian viewers. My second point is that Canadian content is already an impressive global success. A striking fact that should inform your deliberations is that despite comprising less than 0.5% of the world's population, Canadian music captures well over 10% of global streams. Canadian video enjoys similar international success. By these metrics, Canadian creators already outperform peers in Australia and the UK, countries with comparable cultural ambitions. The evidence suggests that Canadian creators are thriving where audiences actually are, on digital platforms. The proposed regulatory changes can risk hindering rather than helping that remarkable success. Third, there's quite a large amount of differentiation between media business models and even among different providers in the same media. But current regulatory approaches treat vastly different business models identically, and this can create real problems. Consider the one-to-one rule, which treats all independent services equally when they have vastly different audience needs and economic models. This can create inefficiencies where consumers pay higher prices for popular services to cross-subsidize carriage of content regardless of actual demand or optimal business models. Audio and video services operate under fundamentally different constraints. Audio services shoulder these perpetual royalty obligations for every single play that I mentioned earlier, while video streamers are able to amortize expensive originals across large libraries. Music services essentially sell the same 100 million track catalog, competing primarily on user experience. Video platforms differentiate through exclusive content, also on user experience, but also with bundling options, often very different types of service offerings. Consumer behavior differs dramatically between these media. Average video search time has increased to 10.5 minutes from 7.5 minutes in 2019 due to content abundance. Meanwhile, something like 120,000 new audio tracks hit services daily. This means that discoverability, not funding of content, is really the central challenge of our current age. Fourth, current Canadian content definitions emphasize IP ownership over cultural impact. This forces producers to choose between maintaining domestic qualification and accessing international distribution networks that could maximize their global reach. Global studios are the second largest source of financing for Canadian content production. Rigid ownership requirements discourage international investment and create barriers to the very partnerships that could expand Canada's content global footprint. Finally, AI-powered discovery mechanisms are already surpassing traditional programming and matching content with interested audiences. Services like Spotify's AI DJ create personalized streams while introducing Canadian content to receptive international listeners. This represents a leap beyond what traditional quota systems could ever achieve. Rather than prescriptive mandates, the Commission should focus on measurable outcomes, incentivize data-driven promotion of Canadian content to receptive audiences, recognize in-kind investments in algorithmic curation and artist analytic tools, and foster experimentation with periodic reporting on Canada's global content share. In conclusion, Canadian creators are succeeding globally because digital platforms amplify their reach. I think the numbers prove this unequivocally. I also believe a flexible evidence-led regime grounded in discoverability metrics rather than rigid contribution frameworks would achieve your cultural objectives while keeping Canada competitive in the global marketplace. Fixed levies and inflexible ownership rules risk reducing, not increasing, the global prominence of Canadian artists and producers that they have earned through innovation and talent. The streaming revolution has been extraordinarily good for Canadian content. Let's not regulate away that success. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much for being with us on this late afternoon, although it's not too late, it's 2:30. Thank you very much nonetheless. I will turn things to Conseillère Paquette, who will lead the questions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stout.
Good afternoon.
So I read your intervention very attentively, and I have, of course, a few questions, but maybe a prior question. I see that you, as well as the two other authors of your study, are from the USA.
Yes.
You're from New Jersey, and Mr. Fruit and Mr. Main are from Oregon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I was wondering, what was your motivation in making this study on Canadian regulation and appearing in front of us? Is it something you do in other jurisdictions as well?
Yeah, so my organization is a policy research organization with an international focus. So what we do is apply what's called the law and economics methodology to questions of law and public policy. So we look for areas where economic analysis would do really well to help inform regulators and policymakers. So we frequently, across a wide variety of topic areas, will appear before courts, appear before regulators, both in the United States and abroad. I personally tend to do a lot of work that focuses on Europe, Canada, United States, and looking at how these jurisdictions interact. One of my interests, and I have worked on this topic, for instance, in the European context, in the AVSMD, the Audiovisual Services Media Directive, which is not the same thing, but is a very similar topic area. And then in the United States, I study video regulation changes and how we're looking at basically the same problems, but coming at them from different areas. And my motivation for looking at these in other jurisdictions is, notwithstanding recent news where there's some bad feelings, I think we're all friends, and that our regulatory systems do inform each other, and that our long-term interests are all mutually interdependent.
Okay, but I understand you're not doing this only for Canada, but for another jurisdiction as well.
Yes, that's correct.
So your expertise on the Canadian market, how would you qualify it? Is it good?
I would say that my expertise is primarily on economic analysis of video markets generally. I have much more content knowledge of the United States market in terms of the regulatory interactions. My interest in the Canadian market and in the European market is really to try to make sure that some of the lessons we've learned here and some of the lessons of economics are at least included in the regulatory deliberations.
Okay. And you warn us of unintended consequences with regulating the audiovisual or the music sector. You say, among other things, and I'm going to try to summarize quickly, but you say first that making the distribution of independent services mandatory could have the impact of these independent services having less incentive to invest in marketing, production, audience, and analytic, which you say factors are critical to organic growth. You also say that basing the definition of Canadian content on the ownership of copyright misaligns incentives in the content production and distribution, and that mandated discoverability regulation risk creating inefficiencies by overriding consumer preferences. So this is things that I read in the document that you submitted. But I guess my question is, our broadcasting ecosystem has been built on very similar principles, like mandatory redistribution of certain services, Canadian ownership, music quotas. So from your point of view, have there been any unintended consequences to this approach that we had for the last, I would say, 50 years?
Well, so the unintended consequences, I don't know if they're specific to Canada, but we have similar issues in the United States as well. that I could speak to a little bit more by analogy. The unintended consequences is that you will mire existing legacy providers under regulatory regimes that are based on presumptions that held, say, in the middle of the 20th century and the later 20th century, and that increasingly are no longer the case. One of the problems that legacy providers all around the world are facing is that the regulations developed almost identically in a lot of these jurisdictions based on the idiosyncrasies of the technology at the time. We heard one of the earlier interventions say that we've seen technological change before, we're used to that. I absolutely agree. The problem with the regulations around the world that we see frequently is that they are premised from starting positions where you assume something like market dominance because of a very new technology at the time. So like broadcasting, presuming that there's a scarcity of spectrum, locking regulations and locking business models into this assumption that there's a scarce spectrum that is a public good, and then therefore all programming needs to be regulated to make sure that public good is being used correctly. You see similar things with satellite, cable TV, especially as it developed in the United States, had a similar kind of constrained business model where you could literally only run that cable through rights of way. They had to negotiate with municipalities. Frequently, you would just be a monopoly provider in these local markets. That's not the world we live in anymore. So what you actually face in local video markets is that consumers have a tremendous amount of demand, or a tremendous amount of power in their demand of these services, and that subscriber churn, if you look at the digital platform sides, subscriber churn is a major headache for all of these providers. They are having trouble actually turning profits on a lot of their platforms. And what that means in terms of unintended consequences is that a lot of legacy providers will struggle under these previous regulations that were well-intentioned and based on perhaps market power assumptions that are no longer the case. The world we live in today is that there are really no video providers that actually have market power if you're considering the power of consumers to shape the decisions and the business models of these different providers.
So some could say that these rules have delivered a well-balanced ecosystem which gave results for decades, and that the reason why this ecosystem is presently imbalanced is because the regulatory requirements are not applied in a fair and equitable manner to the online services. Can you comment on this?
I mean, that is one way to look at it. I may not look at it that way. The way I would look at it instead is that I believe that all of the regulations that were written were well-intentioned at the time, and they were based on the limitations of the technology, the limitations of audience reach and audience power at the time. The world we live in now is a much more dynamic one where a lot of these companies do not know how to actually turn a profit. And trying to apply legacy regulations written for presumptions of market power that just don't exist anymore to new providers who still are not figuring out how to make money, I think would be problematic. There was one of the interventions earlier mentioned something about the market cap of Apple, and I think maybe Amazon as well. But that's actually very misleading to look at it from that way. The video and audio segments of those providers are a very small part of the overall market cap, and these providers are not going to look at money losers as an infinitely supplyable good. At some point, they have to actually make decisions, and you see this with the way the different streaming providers now are trying to figure out how to rebundle content. In the United States, one of the big conversations that's ongoing is how do we provide sports content to users in local markets? It's a very similar analog to the Canadian local content problem, and no one's quite sure how to do it, even without those regulatory overlays. So now, if you actually apply regulatory overlays, presuming some sort of market dominance that doesn't exist, you're only going to make it harder for these industries to provide value to users.
Okay. And you could recommend a market-driven approach, very clearly, supported by regulatory intervention only once a market failure has been detected. Can you explain how this proposed approach would support the policy objective of the Broadcasting Act, such as ensuring diversity of programming and that the broadcasting system should reflect all Canadians?
Yeah, so I could say two things to that. One, I thought the previous intervention where he was suggesting that there was perhaps some funding that could be available for discoverability. Those sorts of interventions, although I may not, if you asked me in my perfect world to make a list of my favorite things to do, that might not make it immediately, but very frequently when you're doing an economic analysis of regulations, you want to try to find the sort of least harmful interventions. And I I will generally prefer to look at regulations that do something like a direct subsidy to concerned areas versus trying to put vast obligations on a whole network of companies and try to figure out how to tweak a market that way. So in that case, and that feeds into my second point, I think, yes, it would be fair to say that I tend to prefer market-driven approaches that look for actual market failures and then correct them. I think the way that can feed into the mission of the CRTC and in the Act is look at where discoverability is not working. Like, we know that there is a tremendous amount of content, both Canadian and non-Canadian, on all of these services. The problem we have is not, in this world that we live in, and I could say this as a musician who tries to figure out how to get people to listen to his music. The problem is not that there's not enough music and there's not enough video in the world. I think that's true even for Canadian content. There's a lot of really great Canadian content. The problem is how the users who actually want to view it can get access to that. So, and that's not just Canadian audiences as well. Like, an anecdote, my sister-in-law is obsessed with Finnish and German television. All she talks about is Finnish and German television. She seeks it out on these streaming services, and then the algorithms find a way to feed that to her. I think the market failure that you would want to look at that would further the mission of your act is, where are those users who are desiring the particular Canadian content not able to get that? And I think the way you get that is not by levies and mandates, but by working with the different providers to get data to figure out where there are actually failures in the system as you see it, that maybe the streaming providers, they have a blind spot to. And when you identify that, then maybe there are regulatory interventions that need to happen. There might be direct funding that needs to happen. There might be other things. But until you actually identify those failures, you're sort of regulating in a void.
Okay, so you mentioned data. What kind of data would be necessary in your mind, and what kind of data could be provided by the streamers and the platform to help us understand where the market failures are?
So I don't know what data the providers have personally. I don't work for any of the providers, and I don't have access to their data. I assume, just knowing how sophisticated a lot of these providers are from studying how they operate in other areas like artificial intelligence and digital platform regulations, I assume they have a lot of data on user sentiment, on where users are spending time, that at a first glance, they probably could provide you with reports at where they see user interest being. At a broader level, maybe it makes sense. I don't know if the commission has this authority or funding for this, but it might make sense to do something like survey type of research with actual Canadian consumers of these services and actually ask them, like, what is it that you would like to see on these services that you're not seeing? And if you actually see that, like, so for instance, I think the documentary intervention was really interesting to listen to. There definitely might be some particularly interesting topics in Canadian documentaries that Canadians might want to see. It's not going to be every documentary, we know that, and this was my point when I was talking about the potential unintended consequences of something like the one-to-one rule. If you throw a bunch of money at all documentaries, you are going to be oversupplying the market when there's not enough demand for it. But we know that there are people that really want to watch Canadian documentaries. So if the commission could actually use its powers and its funding to reach out to consumers and figure out where they're not being served, I think that gives you a really great starting point for future regulations.
Okay, so this question of data is quite central in this hearing. We're trying to figure, what would be the best measure to measure the performance of our ecosystem. And so if you have any suggestion or any idea, don't hesitate to share them in your final submission. So
I'd be happy to.
I have no more question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Conseillère Paquette. I will turn things over to Commissioner Abramson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. With
all of your musical instruments. It's quite impressive.
It's a problem.
So, as you know, we're not a competition regulator. Competition is an important tool for achieving the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. Ultimately, it is the presence or absence of the attainment of those objectives that defines what you might call market failure for us. But competition is an important tool. I take it, when you talk about the presence or absence of market failure, that competition among intermediaries is a big part of what we're talking about. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. It's competition on that level, but then you also have to be careful when you're doing a competition analysis to look at the product market and the actual geographic market. So it can be confusing or misleading sometimes, is a better word, to look at saying like, well, there's like 3 really large streamers, but maybe there's like 10 more streamers you might bring in. But then if you actually look at particular areas where consumers are looking at this content, the product markets might look different.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Are barriers to entry an important part of looking at that competition between intermediaries in a given product market? In other words, is that something that we should be worried about? And can barriers to entry be more or less important in different markets depending on, what the market is meant to output, I suppose, as a policy goal?
100%. Barriers to entry, depending on the market, as you know, will operate differently. So like, for instance, in the provision of broadband services, which is not the topic here, you typically see very high barriers to entry because of the amount of investment that has to go into building out an actual network. In the 20th century, you would have seen the same thing, say, in your remit on the cable services, where you needed to build out a functional network before people wanted to subscribe to it. Barriers to entry in the video markets have been changing. Say 10 years ago, I believe they were relatively higher than they are now. At this point, we have a relatively mature ecosystem. It is not to say that they're completely low. Obviously, you need investment funds in order to do it, but we have a number of competing cloud providers that are able to do the hosting for the video content in their services. There's a plethora of access to different kinds of talent for developing these services. A lot of times where the hang-up comes in the barriers would be in access to the content itself, which requires sophistication in having a good legal department that can do licensing negotiations in order to get the catalog, or having the ability to go out and work with creators and either figure out how to do a revenue sharing or actually produce the content and own it for the platforms themselves. So I would put the barriers to entry at like a relatively, it's not high, but I wouldn't call them low for video entry. For producers of content, I would characterize them as much lower than they've ever been.
And I apologize, I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to focus on the intermediary role. That's really where my interest lies.
Okay, that's fine then. Yeah.
So I want to try and connect that to the discussion that you've been having around data. It seems to me that we ought to be well apprised of what barriers to entry exist into the market for curation or intermediary services in the different product markets you talked about. What sort of data do you think we ought to be looking at in order to maintain an active watch on that?
What data for barriers to entry? Is that your question?
Yeah, data on sort of maintaining a watch over what barriers to entry exist that would harm competition in the markets for curation and intermediary services in the different streaming and music markets.
Right, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. So it's different between the music and the streaming and the video markets. Pretty different, in my opinion. As I mentioned in my remarks, the audio streaming market is essentially a commodity market for all intents and purposes. Obviously there's some differentiation between the catalogs depending on which artist is mad at which streaming platform, but by and large, there's the same access to the same catalog across the major providers. So the barriers to entry in that case is being able to create the initial negotiations in order to access the content from the rights holders, which is a complicated undertaking. The other side of that would be looking at what the technology costs are, I guess, at any given time for running that. I don't think that you would see a barrier to entry on the audio streaming side that would be as interesting apart from those two areas. And I don't think the technology side is going to be getting much worse because we just see a lot of those are themselves becoming commodity prices. So it's really on the access to the licensed material. On what you might want to call a barrier to entry, which I would push back on though, would be user loyalty to the platforms And that user loyalty is really based on how well the platform service consumer needs and how low the prices are. Because again, these are very commoditized services. Any of these services that breaks ranks and really raises prices too high, it's very easy for users to switch over to a new service. And the user loyalty is frequently based on liking the way playlists work, or liking the particular AI discovery services, things like that. On the video side, that one's a much more complicated topic to analyze, because as I mentioned during my comments and in response to one of the other questions, the video markets, a lot of those providers, when you actually see their numbers, they're not making money yet, which means that we don't have a stable ecosystem in which we can really assess what does it look like to even approach market dominance. Until we actually start to see reduction in churn and increase in profit, we don't know what they're trying to capture. So we don't really know what would be a barrier yet, because they're all trying to discover that. So the kind of data that I would want to collect is actually looking at where different experiments, particularly in bundling, as they're trying to experiment with, are successful or not successful. Look at where different platforms have the ability to reduce churn rate, and see if those are a function of offering features that users like, or if it's some other, market manipulation that maybe is being undertaken that they discover. That's the data I would look for. I think right now it would be very difficult to find those markers.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers. And Madam Chair, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Abramson, and thanks to you for being with us this afternoon. We appreciate your contribution and your in-depth analysis of the world we live into. And so have a very good afternoon, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Madame la Secrétaire.
Thank you. I now invite on-screen Manitoba to come to the presentation table.